Every object has a story. It's a nice thought, a romantic idea that a piece of furniture or an old trinket holds the echoes of the lives that used it. But what if that story isn't just a memory? What if it's a living thing, a presence that clings to the wood and fabric, waiting for a new owner to bring it to life? When I found the ad on Marketplace, I wasn't looking for a ghost. I was just looking for a deal. The listing was for an antique rocking chair, a beautiful piece with intricate carvings and worn, faded velvet. The price was unbelievably low, and the description was minimal. Old chair, needs a new home. I drove out to a remote farmhouse on the edge of town, thinking I was just picking up a piece of furniture. I was actually picking up a passenger. The house was a crumbling Victorian, swallowed by overgrown weeds and shrouded in the shade of ancient oak trees. A thin old woman, with wispy gray hair and eyes that seemed too large for her face, answered the door. Her name was Eleanor, and her voice was a breathy whisper. She led me into a living room that was packed with heavy, dust-covered furniture, all of it old and tired. The rocking chair was sitting in the middle of the room, as if waiting. It was even more beautiful in person, with a dark cherry finish and a plush cushion that looked surprisingly inviting. I gave her the cash, and as I was preparing to take it, she stopped me, her frail hand on my arm. "Be gentle with her," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She doesn't like to be moved quickly. She's been with me for a long time. She's family, in a way." Her words were strange, but I just smiled and nodded, thinking she was a lonely old woman, attached to her belongings. I didn't realize she wasn't attached to the chair. She was attached to what was in the chair. I got the chair home and set it up in the corner of my living room, next to a large window. It looked perfect, a contrast to my modern, minimalist decor. The first night, I sat in it, feeling its smooth, worn wood and the gentle, comfortable sway of the rockers. The chair made a soft, rhythmic creak, a sound that was at first comforting. But as the evening wore on, I noticed something strange. I would get up to get a glass of water, and when I walked back into the living room, the chair was still rocking. Just a faint, slow swing that would gradually fade. I chalked it up to momentum, a phantom sway from my own weight, but it was unnerving. The next day, the chair creaked again. I was in the kitchen, and I heard the familiar rhythmic sound coming from the living room. It stopped the moment I walked in. I stood there for a long time, the silence of the room now heavy and expectant. I felt a cold spot on my arm, a fleeting sensation that vanished as quickly as it came. The phenomena escalated slowly, insidiously. The creaking became more deliberate, more insistent. It would happen even when I was nowhere near the chair, a slow, regular cadence in an otherwise silent house. I started to notice other things. The temperature in the corner where the chair sat was always colder than the rest of the room. When I sat in it, I felt a strange weight on my lap, a heavy, pressing feeling that made me jump up in a panic. I would try to rationalize a draft from the window, an old chair's quirks. But one night, as I was trying to fall asleep, I heard the faint, rhythmic creaking coming from the living room. I crept to the doorway and peered out. The room was dark, but in the pale moonlight, I could see the silhouette of the chair swaying, slowly, back and forth, entirely on its own. I watched in a horrified daze, and then, a faint whisper, barely audible, seemed to come from the chair itself, a long, drawn-out sigh that ended with a single word, home. I stopped using the chair. I moved it to a corner and covered it with a blanket, but the creaking continued. It began to follow me. I would hear it from the living room when I was in my bedroom, and sometimes, a single, lonely creak would come from just outside my door. The atmosphere in my house was no longer comfortable. It was thick with a sense of being watched, a profound feeling of not being alone. I started searching for information about the chair, a serial number, or a manufacturer's mark. There was nothing, but tucked into a fold of the velvet cushion, I found a small, embroidered piece of fabric, a name, and a date. Lillian, 1927. I tried to find information about the name, but my search turned up nothing. One evening, as I was sitting on my couch, the humming in the room grew louder. The creaking from the chair started, not a slow rhythm, but a frantic, rapid-fire squeak of wood against wood. The blanket I had placed over it began to lift, as if a hand was slowly pulling it away. I felt a sudden, icy touch on my face, and the whisper was no longer faint. "Help me," it said, a desperate, hollow sound right next to my ear. The climax came in the dead of night. I was jolted awake by the violent sound of the chair rocking. It wasn't a gentle sway. It was a furious, violent movement that shook the floorboards. The rhythm was a terrifying, panicked beat. The humming in my room was deafening, and I could hear a frantic whispering, a chorus of ghostly voices all saying the same thing over and over. "Don't leave her. Don't leave her." I ran to the living room, and what I saw froze the blood in my veins. The rocking chair was thrashing back and forth, so violently it was hitting the wall. The blanket was on the floor, and in the space where the chair should have been, I saw a faint, shimmering outline of a person sitting in it. A ghostly figure with long hair, its head bowed in a posture of profound grief. The whispering grew to a shriek, a sound of pure anguish, and the chair, with the rocking figure, began to turn, slowly and deliberately, toward me. I didn't wait to see more. I ran out of the house, leaving the chair and everything else behind. I drove to a friend's place and never returned. I paid someone to go to my house and remove the chair, taking it far away, to a dump where it would be destroyed. The old woman, Eleanor, was gone. Her house was listed for sale a week later. I don't know what happened to the chair or the woman who was in it. But sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet room, I can still hear the ghost of that rhythmic creaking, a slow, lonely sway in the back of my mind. And I know that Eleanor wasn't selling a chair. She was selling a place to rest, a prison for a restless ghost, and I had, for one terrifying week, become its new warden. We tell ourselves we're the masters of our technology, but we're just pressing buttons and flicking switches. We're the user, but we're not the one in control. Sometimes, a piece of tech can have a mind of its own, an insidious purpose far beyond its intended function. It can change you, rewrite your reality, and trap you inside a world of its own making. I learned this the hard way, all because of a marketplace ad for an old gaming console. The ad simply said, "Rare unit, not working, free to a good home. 4 parts only." It was a vintage system from my childhood, a piece of nostalgia I couldn't pass up. But it wasn't just a piece of plastic and wires. It was a doorway, and I was about to walk right through it. The ad led me to a quiet, suburban neighborhood, to a house that was unsettling in its perfection. The lawn was immaculately cut. The paint was fresh, and not a single leaf marred the walkway. A young man, pale and gaunt, answered the door. He spoke in a monotone, his eyes never quite meeting mine. He handed me the console, a heavy, blocky piece of gray plastic, along with a single unlabeled game cartridge. "It's for a project," he said, his voice flat. "It needs a home." His house was sparse, almost empty. There was no furniture, no pictures on the walls, just a single, neatly folded blanket on the floor. It felt less like a home and more like a waiting room. I paid him nothing, as the ad promised, but as I left, I felt as though I had just made a much larger transaction. I had paid with my sense of peace. Back in my apartment, I set to work on the console. It took a few hours of tinkering, but I eventually got it to power on. The music box lullaby from the sound design played briefly on the startup screen before I inserted the unlabeled cartridge. The game was simple, a maze, An 8-bit top-down view of an endless black and white labyrinth. A single, faceless character moved with stiff, jerky motions. There was no goal, no enemies, no score. Just a maze that seemed to repeat itself. A labyrinth of dead ends and looping corridors. I found myself playing it for hours. The simplicity of it is strange, hypnotic comfort. But the comfort soon began to curdle into something else. The hum from the console, the same one I had heard at the start, began to grow louder. It was a constant, low buzz that seemed to permeate the air. The game started to seep into my reality. I would be walking down the hallway of my apartment and see the clean, geometric lines of the game's corridors in the patterns of the carpet. I would look at the books on my bookshelf and see the familiar blocky shapes of the maze walls in their arrangement. I started to play the game obsessively. Hours bled into days, and my life outside the game began to feel like a meaningless chore. The faceless character from the game began to appear in my peripheral vision. I would catch a glimpse of it in a reflection in my TV screen, a stark, white figure standing still and silent in my dark living room. When I turned my head, it was gone, leaving nothing but a lingering sense of cold dread. The music box lullaby began to play again, a warped, off-key melody that seemed to come from the console even when it was off, a ghost in the machine that was slowly taking over my senses. The paranoia became a constant companion. I started to document the strange occurrences. I took photos of the patterns I was seeing on my walls, but they looked normal in the pictures, just a trick of the light. I turned off the console, unplugged it, even put it in a box and hid it in my closet, but the humming continued. The music box lullaby still played in my head. I began to feel like I was the character in the maze, aimlessly wandering through the repeating corridors of my own life, with no escape in sight. I tried to talk to friends, but I couldn't explain what was happening without sounding insane. The gaunt face of the seller, his flat voice, his empty house, they all took on a new, sinister meaning. He hadn't just given me a console, he had passed on a curse, a digital parasite that was slowly devouring my reality. I was losing myself to the maze, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the only way to escape was to solve it. The climax came in the middle of a sleepless night. I couldn't fight the compulsion anymore. I retrieved the console from the closet, plugged it in, and inserted the cartridge. The music box lullaby played, louder and more distorted than ever, and I watched the screen, my eyes burning from exhaustion. The game started, and I saw my character, a small, faceless thing, standing in the center of a maze. But this time, the maze was different. It was my apartment. The 8-bit walls were my living room furniture. The corridors were my hallways. I watched as the character moved, its jerky steps mirrored by the sound of something shuffling in my own kitchen. I heard the muffled footsteps moving into the hallway, then toward my bedroom. I was frozen in terror, my eyes darting from the screen to the doorway. The music box stopped, replaced by a single high-pitched tone, and the screen went black, save for a single line of text. "You have solved the maze." I looked up from the console, and in the corner of my room, in the deepest shadow, the faceless character from the game was standing there. Its white, empty face turned toward me. I didn't think, I just reacted. I grabbed the console, ran out of my apartment, and threw it into the dumpster with a final, desperate smash. The screen shattered, the music box sound died, and the humming finally stopped. The next day, I moved out, leaving everything behind. I couldn't stand to be in that apartment anymore. Couldn't stand the sight of the geometric patterns on the walls that were no longer just a trick of the light. The faceless character from the game still appears in my peripheral vision sometimes. A brief, white flash that reminds me that I'm not entirely free. The add-on marketplace is gone, but I know what happened. I didn't solve the maze. I just got out of the game. And now, my entire life, my whole world, has become the maze. I'm still trapped in it, forever searching for a way out, and forever terrified of what I might find waiting for me around the next corner. There's a special kind of hope that comes with preparing for a new life. You fill a room with soft colors, tiny clothes, and the gentle promise of a future. You want everything to be perfect, pristine, and clean. So when I found the antique basket on Marketplace, with its delicate carvings and faded ribbons, I saw not a used item, but a piece of history, a story waiting for a new chapter. I saw a symbol of a life that had come before, a beautiful, gentle memory I wanted to welcome into my home. What I didn't see was the profound, aching sorrow clinging to its every curve. The grief of a mother who couldn't let go, and the ghost of a child who never was. The listing was from a woman named Helen, and her profile picture showed a kind-faced grandmotherly figure. The bassinet was listed for a very reasonable price, with a description that simply said, "Well-loved bassinet. Needs a new home for a new family." The address was for a nice, well-kept suburban house. Helen greeted me at the door with a warm but too intense smile. The house was spotless, with every item perfectly in place. But I noticed something was missing: any sign of a child. No pictures on the walls, no toys on the floor, no scent of baby powder or laundered blankets. The bassinet sat in the middle of a spare room, a solitary piece in an otherwise empty space. Helen stroked the bassinet's ribbon with a reverence that was unsettling. "She's very special," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the empty cradle. "She was my baby's first bed." Her words were a little strange, but I just thought she was a sentimental woman. I didn't realize she was trying to pass on something far heavier than a piece of furniture. I brought the bassinet home and set it up in the nursery, a room I had spent months decorating. It looked perfect, a beautiful anchor for the new life I was preparing for. But that first night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic creak, a gentle sway that seemed to come from the nursery. I went in to check, but the bassinet was still. I blamed a draft from the window, a trick of the light. But the next day, the gentle rocking returned. I would be in the kitchen and hear the sound, a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to be humming its own quiet lullaby. Then came the laughter. It was faint, like a distant whisper, a tinny, high-pitched giggle that seemed to emanate from the bassinet itself. It was so fleeting, so soft, that I told myself it was my imagination, a symptom of my pregnancy. But the laughter and the rocking were so persistent that I found myself standing outside the nursery door, holding my breath and listening, a cold dread beginning to settle deep in my stomach. My communication with Helen grew increasingly strange and frequent. She would send me texts asking, "Is the baby sleeping well? And is he happy in his bed?" I hadn't told her if I was having a boy or a girl. The texts became more and more personal, almost possessive, as if she was already a part of my family, a ghost in my phone. One night, while inspecting the bassinet for a loose screw, I noticed a small hidden compartment under the mattress. Inside, I found a small, faded baby blanket with an intricate, hand-stitched name on it, Lillian. The date sewn beneath it was decades old. The name wasn't a family name. It was just a name that didn't belong to me. My blood ran cold. The laughter wasn't a memory, it was a ghost. And Helen wasn't a kind grandmother. She was a woman who was haunted by a grief so profound. She had convinced herself the bassinet was still occupied, and she had passed that delusion, and the ghost that came with it, on to me. The rocking became more forceful, a panicked sway that shook the room, and the laughter was no longer faint. It was a clear, high-pitched sound of a child's pure, unadulterated joy. But it was a joy that was tinged with something else, a deep-seated sadness that made my heart ache. The climax came a few nights later, The laughter and the rocking had reached a fever pitch, a frantic, desperate rhythm that made the whole house feel alive with a manic energy. I went into the nursery, my heart pounding in my chest, and stood over the bassinet. It was rocking violently, its old wood groaning under the strain. The laughter was now a deafening chorus, a sound so full of both joy and sorrow that it was an agonizing assault on my senses. I watched in a horrified daze as a faint, ethereal outline of a small figure began to form in the bassinet, a hazy shape with a tiny, indistinct face. A profound, icy coldness emanated from the bassinet, and I felt a heavy, pressing weight on my heart, a profound sense of sadness and loss that was not my own. The child's laughter was not happy. It was a sound of desperate, eternal play, an endless loop of a life that never got to be. Helen hadn't been giving her baby a new home. She had been trying to get rid of a ghost that was tied to the bassinet, a soul so lost it had become a part of the wood itself. I screamed, a primal sound of terror and grief, and ran from the house. I drove to the nearest highway, the laughter from the bassinet, a deafening echo in my mind. I pulled to the side of the road, dragged the bassinet from my car, and left it there, on the desolate shoulder, a ghost ship waiting for a new captain. I drove away, never looking back. I never heard from Helen again, and the marketplace ad disappeared. But to this day, I can't shake the fear. I see pictures of my own child, now years old, and I hear the faint, tinny echo of a child's laughter, a sound that reminds me of a sorrow that was not my own, and a ghost that was waiting for a new life to become a part of. And I wonder, with a profound and lasting dread, if the bassinet was just a prison, or if a piece of that sorrow, a piece of that laughter, is still in my home, waiting for a new chapter to begin.